Well, good afternoon, everybody. You know, when you do a lot of presenting, this is actually my 5th Tech Ed that I've presented at. When you do a lot of presenting, it's always kind of dicey when you get that session right after lunch. And like the night before, you have these nightmares that you walk into walk into lunch that day, and they're serving like huge portions of turkey with mashed potatoes and stuffing and stuff like that. And then everybody's doing like a, post-Thanksgiving dinner kind of afterwards. So hopefully they serve something that's not so food coma inducing today at lunch. But even if they did, we've got lots of really cool stuff to talk about as far as building solutions for the cloud with SharePoint Online. For those of you that I haven't had a chance to meet at prior Tech Eds or down at the booth or whatnot, my name's Chris Mayo. I'm a technical evangelist for SharePoint Online and Office 365 as a platform. So I don't deal too much with the product, though I know the product very well. I deal more with building solutions for these products. So like you, I'm a developer. And the session we're going to be going through over the next hour and 15 minutes is developing collaboration solutions for the cloud with SharePoint Online. So with Office 365 and these new services, like what is the opportunity for customizing and extending or building, custom solutions that run up in the cloud based on, Office 365. And as a developer, when a new platform comes out, I always ask myself, okay, so what are the new features or what are the new benefits of this platform? And, how is it different or similar to like the last version? Just so I know, what do I have to learn? What's new for me to learn, or what skills can I already reuse? If I'm going to build solutions and extract those benefits from the new version. Well, Office 365, the services in Office 365 are based on the 2010 version of the on-prem servers. So SharePoint Online is based on SharePoint 2010. Exchange Online is based on Exchange 2010. Of course, Link Online is based on Link Server 2010. So while they're not 100% feature parity between the on-premise server and the service, you kind of have an idea of what features and functionalities you're getting with Office 365. But if the features are roughly the same, as what you're used to on-prem, what's the big benefit of moving to Office 365? Well, Office 365 is software as a service, right? So we run SharePoint, Exchange, and Link up in the cloud for you. So rather than you having to set up and maintain, a bunch of servers and worry about upgrades and patches and networking and security and all that stuff, you get that at a per user, per month fee as a part of buying the service, right? So when you need to add more users, you don't have to add more servers, you just add a new license, right? The costs are predictable because it's a per user, per month fee, right? The reliability and the security are baked in. So you're getting these same features and functionalities as the on-prem servers, but you're getting it in a much more efficient and cost-friendly way. But that's not what we're going to be talking about for the next hour. What we're going to be talking about over the course of the next hour is how to build solutions based on the SharePoint Online service. Okay? So here's our agenda. The first thing I'm going to go through is kind of what is SharePoint Online, just so you can get an idea if you're a SharePoint developer. In fact, how many folks here are SharePoint 2010 developers today? Okay, and how many folks are on 2007? Okay, great. So I'll kind of talk about what is SharePoint Online, and from a product perspective, how is it different from the on-prem server? From there, we'll dive into the platform, and I'll talk about, again, how is SharePoint Online, when I'm talking about building solutions, how is it different from what I'm used to today if I'm used to building SharePoint 2010 solutions? What are the similarities? What are the differences? Okay? And then we'll go through a number of demos where we'll actually build out a simple demo scenario just to kind of show you the ins and outs of the platform and kind of give you a feel for which of your what you already know, how much of that applies, what do you need to learn that's different, and those things. And then we'll wrap up. My plan is to wrap up with plenty of time for questions and stuff like that. And I've got a lot of resources at the end of these slides as far as articles and white papers and things along those lines We actually have a full training kit up on MSDN, so if you want to start building solutions with SharePoint Online, Link Online, and Exchange Online, you can download the kit, watch the videos, do the labs and stuff, and I've got a link to that here at the end of these slides. Okay? So, SharePoint Online ships with Office 365. You might have heard of Business Productivity Online Services, which is our current software as a service offering for SharePoint and Exchange, and in that case, a communications server. Well, Office 365 is just the next generation of those services. And again, it's SharePoint Online, it's Link Online, and it's Exchange Online. And all the new services are based on the 2010 versions of those servers. And again, it's software as a service, so you pay per user per month. And there's licenses everywhere from small business, $6 per user per month, to an enterprise version, which is $10 per user per month, and then an enterprise version that includes Office Professional Plus as part of the subscription. It's like $24 per user per month. And I've got a link so you can get an idea of what the different versions are and how do they differ and what the prices are and stuff like that. We're actually in beta today, so there's a public beta. You can go up to office365.com and sign up for a tenancy and start using the service now. We would love if you went and got a beta tenancy and started using it and give us feedback. And our goal is to release in the first half of this year. Okay, so coming up pretty quickly. So that being said, what is SharePoint Online? Well, SharePoint Online is SharePoint 2010 hosted in the cloud as software as a service. So rather than you setting up the server and installing the OS and installing SharePoint and doing all the administration and so on, the Microsoft Online Data Center team does that. So SharePoint Online is hosted in Microsoft data centers. As far as reliability is concerned, your subscription comes with a 99.9% uptime guarantee. And that service level agreement is a money-back guarantee. So if the service goes under 99.9%, we pay back that portion of your subscription, right, for the time that it was down. We've done the right things as far as securing not only the physical data center and the software and so on, and we went through the process of getting ISO and SAS certified to show you that your data and these services are going to be secure, right? But there's one thing you do need to know, that SharePoint Online is a subset of SharePoint 2010. It's based on 2010, but it doesn't include 100% of the features. And rather than me going through and holding up like a chart or having a slide with a chart and saying this one yes, that one no, this one yes, that one no, as far as a feature by feature comparison, there's a link in the back of this slide called the service descriptions, the Office 365 service descriptions, which does tell you exactly how each of the services is different from what's on-prem, just so you can know what features are going to be different. And some of these features are just things that when we move to a multi-tenant cloud infrastructure, we need to do some work on those features, or the feature didn't make sense in that kind of environment, so we ended up turning it off, okay? And then from a platform perspective, SharePoint Online does represent a subset of the SharePoint 2010 platform, and that's really where we're going to be spending a bulk of our time today, talking about where there's differences and then what you can build, given those differences. So one of the things when you go and you get your Office 365 tenancy and start working with SharePoint Online, one of the first things you'll notice is, you're kind of as a SharePoint administrator or SharePoint developer, you're used to going to central administration and, creating new web applications and within those web applications, creating new site collections and so on. Maybe setting up some front-end stuff depending on how much, front-end servers and doing the failover and reliability and all that stuff. You might be, actually doing that in your company now with SharePoint 2010. So you're used to doing, server farm work with web applications, then working with web applications to start building out site collections and then subsites and so on down the line. But one thing that you're going to get used to when you start working with SharePoint Online is that the front-end servers, all the server infrastructure, the networking, and so on, that comes with your service, right? So we take care of all of that in the data center, in the cloud data center for SharePoint Online. So your kind of point of entry as far as administering or building solutions for SharePoint Online is at the site collection level. You're actually just managing, creating site collections and giving access to users and then building solutions that run in those site collections, including their sites, lists, libraries, and subsites with lists and libraries and so on. Okay? So curiosity-wise, how many folks have an Office 365 beta account today? Wow, awesome, fantastic. So we'll tell you what, I was going to spend some time, for those that haven't had a chance to see it, what I was going to do is just switch over here and just do a quick demo and kind of set up what we're going to be talking about in the rest of the demos. So this is the office365.com site. This is where you can sign up for a beta account if you don't already have one. Once you get your welcome mail, it'll give you the details about setting up users and all that stuff. I've actually gone through the process of setting up my initial tenancy. So I'm just going to sign in here as my tenancy admin. Okay, and this is the administration screen for Office 365. And as a normal user, you'd have, the home screen where you could, do things like look at mail and calendar and go to your team site and install link and stuff like that, or go to your mail and Outlook or your team site. But I have this admin link because I'm the tenancy admin. Oops. And one of the first things that I do as a tenancy admin is I'd want to get my users set up in Office 365, give them licenses, and then give them access to the various services so they can start using them. So I'd probably want to set up single sign-on, which is the link right there at the top, where I would, if I have AD, this isn't required. For small business, you're not required to have AD. It's an option for enterprise. But you want to set up single sign-on, so you're synchronizing between AD on-prem with ADFS 2.0 deployed up into org ID or up into the ID system of Office 365. And then once you have that done, you probably want to do some Active Directory synchronization. So, rather than manually entering users or doing like a CSV file, which both of those scenarios are of course supported, you can have just Active Directory just kind of push all those user accounts up there. Once the user accounts are up there, then you can start applying licenses to them. Like here's the Chris Mayo account, and I can give him different licenses. This is an enterprise plan, so I have a choice between a full enterprise license, which includes Office Professional Plus, Office Web Apps, Link, Exchange, and SharePoint, or a kiosk version for users that don't do a lot of heads-down information work, that only has SharePoint Online Kiosk and Exchange Online Kiosk. And then I can set up different users, whether they're going to be a global or an administrator or not, what kind of administrator, like password reset, service administrator, global administrator can do everything. Allow them or block them, and then set their user location based on where they're located. And again, adding new users is just a matter of either synchronizing them from AD or hand typing them in, giving them a license, and then adding another predictable per user per month, fee for that particular user. If users leave the company, it's just a matter of shutting them off, right? Okay, so once I do that, then I'm ready to start working with the services. So for the case of SharePoint Online, I'll go in here and I'll start configuring the service, like creating site collections and so on. And in SharePoint Online, we support two different kinds of site collections. One is a public website site collection. This is a very simple website that you can customize via the browser. It's not SharePoint for Internet sites. That feature is not supported in this version of Office 365. But it is a very easy to use and easy to publish presence for the web that's, again, running up in your tenancy. I can create private site collections, which are site collections that are available to any of my users or external users through the sharing function. In fact, if you look at the different site collections that I have here, the demos I'm going to be doing today are actually in this particular site collection, office365.dpe.sharepoint.com sites CMAO 0365. And you can see here I have a storage usage quota, right? I have a resource usage quota, right? And that's for sandbox solutions, and we'll talk about why that's important here in a couple of demos. But this is the tenancy that I'm going to be doing all the demos on today. And if you look at it, it looks really similar to SharePoint 2010 because SharePoint Online is based on SharePoint 2010 in this version. In fact, if you look at a team site deployed in SharePoint 2010, like this CMAO's O365 on-premise demo site, it looks really, really similar to the version that's running up in the cloud. Okay? So a lot of what you know about SharePoint 2010, again, go to the service descriptions and see what features are supported or unsupported in SharePoint Online. A lot of what you know about SharePoint 2010 applies from a product perspective or from a service perspective. But now we want to talk about platform and doing customization. So let's go ahead and go back into the slides and talk about that. Okay? So there's a bunch of different ways that you can customize SharePoint. And we as SharePoint users and developers and potentially even admins know this, that you can go into the browser and you can do simple customizations as far as creating lists and creating web parts, creating new sites and so on. All of the out-of-the-browser features that you're used to with SharePoint 2010 are supported in SharePoint Online, right, given the feature differences. Same thing with SharePoint Designer. So SharePoint Designer is a tool that we released with SharePoint 2010 that supports declarative customization of SharePoint 2010. And guess what? It works exactly the same way against SharePoint Online. So as far as doing data manipulation, as far as creating lists and content types and document types and stuff like that, doing customization of your site as far as customizing the master page and applying CSS and adding branding and theming, that's supported, as well as workflows. And we're going to talk about workflows a little bit in this session, and I'm going to talk about workflows a lot in my SharePoint Online workflow session tomorrow afternoon. That's OSP 306. Okay, but what we really want to talk about here is, as developers, what can we do with Visual Studio 2010? And the biggest change that you're going to see across the platform is that SharePoint Online supports sandbox solutions as the only solution type for creating code-based solutions for the service, right? So anything that you want to do with code, as far as code that's going to run in SharePoint Online, it has to be built as a sandbox solution and deployed as a sandbox solution, right? And this makes sense if you think about what a multi-tenant cloud actually is, right? Where we've got these humongous data centers that are geo-dispersed throughout the world, right? And it's this shared infrastructure that individual customers or tenancies run on, right? If you think about, hey, how could I deploy a farm-level solution up into this data center? Well, you can't because all of the servers are the same. The only things that you can deploy are things that you're deploying directly to your tenancy, like to the solution gallery, and that's what sandbox solutions are. But you can do a lot in sandbox solutions. We're going to see that in the demos as far as things that you can do with code, as far as event receivers, feature receivers, web parts, visual web parts with the Power Tools add-in, anything that you can do as far as deploying a declarative solution like declarative workflows, content types, site columns, list definitions, and so on, you can deploy as part of a sandbox solution. Now, we also support the client object model in SharePoint Online. And more often than not, this is actually, you're deploying these solutions as a sandbox solution, but I call it out here specifically. We're going to see this in the demo where you can create Silverlight or JavaScript client solutions that are surfaced or shown in pages, and they can interact with lists and libraries via the client object model. You can also create external clients that, like a .NET client, like a WPF client that can communicate with SharePoint Online via this client object model. So that's what we're going to be covering during the course of these demos, talking about sandbox solutions, what are they, what can you do, showing some solutions, and same thing with the client object model. Okay? So what's not supported in SharePoint Online as far as a platform is concerned? Well, you can't do full trust solutions. You can't do solutions that require that you push out changes to web.config or pushing out files to front-end servers and things along those lines. So again, anything that you can do in a sandbox solution and upload to the solution gallery is fully supported. But I thought I'd just mention some of the things that aren't supported in this release. So timer jobs require full trust. They're not supported. Anything that you have to do with elevated privileges isn't supported. Again, you're working at the site collection level and below. So if you're trying to do something running with elevated privileges, that's not supported. We also aren't shipping support for BCS or external web calls. So in the sandbox, you can't make external web calls, web service calls, and BCS isn't shipping in this version. So that's probably the biggest change as far as SharePoint 2010 versus SharePoint Online, as far as integrating web service calls or external services from the server side. From the client side, of course, you can make service calls to like Azure and web services and REST services and so on. Okay? So let's talk about sandbox solutions. What are they? How do they run? So from a development perspective, sandbox solutions are a scoped version of the API meant to run in this sandboxed or isolated or constrained runtime environment that allows you to not only deploy very quickly and very friction-free compared to like a full trust solution, but it also gives you an environment where you don't have to worry about runaway solutions affecting your site collection or affecting your site and so on. So let's talk about that. So it's a subset of Microsoft.SharePoint. It's scoped to SP site or the site collection and below, which is awesome because that maps directly to what we are working with as far as SharePoint Online. Runs in partial trust, has its own specific code access security policy to help prevent rogue solutions from trying to get access to other kinds of data in other sites or site collections beyond their scope. Visual Studio 2010 has awesome support for sandbox solutions as far as letting you create a new project or item and letting you say whether it's going to be a sandbox solution or not, and then giving you the ability to debug that as a sandbox solution. It has IntelliSense and compilation support. So if you're typing in spsecurity.run with elevated privileges, it's actually not going to complete the IntelliSense statement because run with elevated privileges is not supported in the sandbox. If you install the Visual Studio 2010 Power Tools for SharePoint, you'll actually get compilation support as well as a project item called the Visual Web Part Sandboxed. This is a great tool. You should really, really install this. I've got a link at the end of this slide deck because that compilation support makes it much easier. If you like copying and pasting code from other projects, it'll catch at compile time anything that isn't supported in the sandbox. Okay? And then you can do F5 debugging. Know that the F5 debugging is going to be going against on-prem. We'll talk about kind of the developer experience here in the demo. But you can F5 debug, and it'll throw exceptions if you try and do something that's not supported in the sandbox. And then packaging. VS 2010 will package up your solution into a package file that you can distribute directly to the solution gallery, whether that's on-prem or, in our case, online. Now, from a deployment perspective, deploying sandbox solutions, if you haven't seen this before, is ridiculously easy. It's just a matter of uploading a file to a special gallery or a special document library called a solution gallery, right? So if you think about deploying full trust solutions and pushing files out to and making changes, pushing files out to the web servers or your SharePoint servers or changing web.config or all these things that your IT admins grumble at when you ask to do them, right? It's really, really different when you think about how to do this with sandbox solutions. And each of these individual solutions, they will run in their own sandbox execution environment. So if a solution is throwing exceptions or having problems, it doesn't affect other solutions in that site collection or other site collections, which again makes it awesome for a multi-tenant cloud environment like SharePoint Online. Yeah, you had a question? Yeah, so the question was, is it possible to deploy a sandbox solution to all of the site collections within a tenancy, like automatically? Right. Yeah, that's not supported in this release, so you'd have to take that solution and load it into each solution gallery. Yeah. 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 So what if they have hundreds of or they have hundreds of site collections or something along those lines? Yeah. I'm not aware of a way to automate that, but if you wouldn't mind doing me a favor, my blog is linked at the front of this. I've got a friend that's over on the team that works with the Solution Gallery and works with the IT Pro side. I'd be happy to ask if there's a way to automate that, maybe through remote PowerShell or something. So if you wouldn't mind doing that, or I'll take a note. I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Okay. 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 Yeah, yeah. Then it's probably going to be a manual process. But I'll follow up and I'll check, and I'll post a result on my blog. Okay. So as far as administration of sandbox solutions, they're actually self-administrating. So how this works is your solution, as it executes code on the server side, so inside SharePoint Online, we're actually tracking calls that you make to the server-side libraries and lists that you read and stuff like that. And everything you do actually collects against a resource point quota. And we do this so if there's an incredibly wasteful solution that's, the server-side calls are taking too long, or maybe it's throwing exceptions or something along those lines, the sandbox actually monitors each solution, and if it finds a solution that's actually, running amok, it will actually disable that solution or disable solutions in that site collection to prevent it from kind of running away and disrupting the execution of SharePoint Online as a service in your site collection, or even amongst different site collections. Okay? So the thing to keep in mind about this is if you look at, and I have a resource at the end of the slides, if you look at what it's tracking, right, and you look at kind of the measuring that it's doing and the resource point allocation per measure and stuff like that, if you have a well-formed and well-developed and well-tested solution, you're probably not going to run into this, right? It's really like, for example, if you terminate abnormally, you're going to take a resource point hit, right? And if you do your testing, you're not going to have a solution that terminates abnormally. But if you look at the support documents or the developer documents in MSDN for this sandbox solution, you can kind of get a feel for what the measurement is and how to develop knowing those constraints. Now, one thing that I want to point out is these resource quotas only count against code that runs on the server side. So it doesn't account against anything you do declaratively, and it doesn't count against anything you do with the client object model. It's only when code runs on the server side. So that's another thing to keep in mind. This is just an eye chart that talks about the different project items that are supported in the sandbox. Why don't we go ahead and just do a demo of this? So I'll switch back over to my laptop. And what I thought I'd do is just go and build out a solution in a couple of different demos just to show you, kind of the possibilities around a simple scenario. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to open up two different tabs in IE and talk about the different sites that I'm going to be using. Okay? So one site that I'm going to be using is an on-prem deployment of SharePoint 2010. And I'm going to use this for my development. And you're at a talk talking about SharePoint Online, so why am I using SharePoint 2010? Well, I use a local instance of SharePoint 2010 to do all my development, just like I do with the on-prem server, so I can sit there and make modifications and develop iteratively and debug and so on to the point where I have a solution that actually does everything I need it to do, and then I will take that solution and I will upload it to the solution gallery up in SharePoint Online, do some confirmation testing, and then hand it over to my site collection administrator to actually put into production. So it's really not all that different from what you do with SharePoint 2010 today. You're probably doing like F5 debugging against like a VM or SharePoint on your local machine and getting everything the way that you want it to be, and then taking it to a different farm for confirmation testing and then putting it in production. So it's very similar. I just happen to be doing some of the work here on my local machine, and then I'll do all of my quote-unquote production deployment up to SharePoint Online here. Okay? So you can tell the difference between the two sites because one says CMAO's O365 on-premises demo site, and it's running on contoso.com and the information worker VMs, if you're familiar with those. And then the actual SharePoint Online site is CMAO's O365 demo site, and it's running on .sharepoint.com, okay, because I haven't applied like a domain URL to this yet, okay? So for example, if I wanted to create a solution that tracks purchase requests of my employees. So I want a list that people can enter purchase requests that don't go through the normal processes. And then maybe I want to put together a client object model like Silverlight front end and give them the opportunity to enter those new requests. And then finally, I want to build a workflow that will route those requests to people in the group, the approvers group that actually approve those requests, and then let them, do things like automate that process and maybe, send out email to let them know the request was granted, and then maybe, create a site to track, different aspects of that request, like paperwork and things like those lines. So that's what I'm actually going to do. I'm going to open up Visual Studio. I'll just create a new project here. And I will call this Purchasing Manager. Okay? And the first thing VS is going to ask me is this a sandbox solution or not? Well, I eventually wanted to deploy this to SharePoint Online, so I do want it to be a sandbox solution. One thing that I thought I'd point out is if you create a sandbox solution today and you're on SharePoint 2010, as long as it's a sandbox solution and it doesn't use a feature that's not supported in SharePoint Online, the solution will work equally as well in SharePoint 2010 as it does on SharePoint Online. So if you're not moving to SharePoint Online yet, but want to start building solutions that are SharePoint Online compatible, all you need to know is sandbox solutions. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and say finish here. And I'm going to deploy a list. So I'm going to need like some site columns, a content type, a list definition, and then a list instance. I'm going to do all this declaratively because I know when I do stuff declaratively in a sandbox solution, it doesn't count against my quota. So I'll just say new item. I'm going to say content type. And I'll explain why later, but I need to actually call this a specific name because I've got some other demos that go after this one that depend on that specific name. So I'll create a new content type called non-standard business purchase requests content type. And I'll base that off of item. Okay, and I get an element file for that particular content type that I can start customizing. And I actually need a specific ID, content ID for this, so I'll just put that one in there. And then I need to give it a name. So I'll just call it, oops. So I'll call it Purchasing Manager Non-Standard Business Purchase Requests content type. Okay, and I'll put it in the Purchasing Manager group. And then I want to add some site columns to deploy to this. And rather than you watching me do a lot of typing, I put together some snippets here to define like the site columns for description and price. And then I need to add, some field refs to include those site columns within my content type. Okay, so here you can see I'm going to have, of course, the title column and then the request description and then price. Okay, so let's save that. Let's create a list definition based off of this. So again, I'll just do add new item, and then list definition based off the content type. Okay. I'll click Add, and it'll ask me what content type do I want to base it off of, and of course I want to create it off that content type that I just created, and I want to create a list instance as well, so I'll leave that box checked. Okay. So let's just change this number. I need to give it a unique ID, so it's different from the reserved ones, right? And let's give it a display name. Okay. And then I have to put some columns. You can see here it pulled through my columns because I was based on the content type, so title, request, or request description and price. Let's make sure that all of my various columns show up in view fields. Okay, for both of the views, even though I'm not going to use the mobile one, but it's just a habit. Okay, and then let's rename this guy. Okay, and we'll give this a name that's going to sit well with our users. Non-standard business purchase request. And it's based off of the right type there. Oops. Open the wrong file. I meant to open this one. Okay, so now let's give it a good name for the list, and then we're ready to test. Okay, and I just want to rename my feature so it's easier to see it in the list. So let's call it Purchasing Manager. Content types. Okay, so that's my solution. Let's just go ahead and F6 this guy. Build succeeded. Now I'm going to hit F5 and just make sure that it deploys my list. And it'll package this up, and it'll add the solution to the solution gallery and deploy the features and so on. And you can see here's my lists, right? And if we went through and looked at, you know, the site columns, I'd see my site column in here. Okay, so there's the description and the price site column in the purchasing manager group. And then same thing for the content type. Okay. And then, of course, the list. Okay, so let's say that I wanted to go to tech ed, right? And that's travel, and that's outside of the normal procurement process that we use at my company, my fictional company. So I'll just say Tech Ed US 2011, and it's a technical conference for devs, and I think I can probably do it for about $2,000. Okay, and then there's my list, deployed up in the sandbox. So I'm going to go ahead and close this browser, and then I'm going to package this guy up. And I need this for other demos, so I'm actually going to package it up and deploy it to the solution gallery on-prem. So the list is there permanently, because of course VS takes it away. And then I'll also copy it up into the cloud. And you'll note that it's exactly the same process, right? So I'll go to my top-level on-prem site, say Site Settings. I'll go to the Solution Gallery, where all Sandbox solutions live. I'll say Upload Solution, Browse, and let's go over to where I created that solution. There's my WSP file, and I'll activate it. And now if I go back over to my site, yeah, the list is still there. Awesome. And now up in my SharePoint Online site, the process to deploy this is exactly the same. It's just a matter of uploading the file up into the cloud in the solution gallery. Okay, and it'll run the same because the sandbox is the same on both. Okay, let's make sure it's going to the right place. Yep. So there's my WSP. And activate. Now if I go over to Labo 1 and actually activate the feature, content types, and list instances, I should have my list. Okay? So here's that same solution running up in SharePoint Online. Now let's put SPO here. Okay? So with sandbox solutions, it's very easy to build a solution. In this case, it was entirely declarative. But of course, you can use the Microsoft.SharePoint sandboxed API and build code-based solutions and so on. It's very easy to deploy them. They consume resource points when you're actually doing code that runs within SharePoint Online. You don't consume resource points for declarative solutions, and you don't consume resource points for client-side solutions. But you can see here, it's really, really easy to have code that's running up in SharePoint Online. It's just a matter of creating a sandbox solution, uploading it, and activating the features. And I developed that just like I would develop on-prem today, with the big difference being, I do all my F5 debugging against a local instance of SharePoint to get the solution that I want. When I go to deploy it, I'm just putting it up in the cloud in SharePoint Online rather than deploying it to an on-prem server. Okay? Yeah. Yeah, so the question was, can you do your development on the cloud? And the answer is no. So we don't support F5 debugging up against the cloud or up against SharePoint Online. It's also kind of one of those things that, when I'm sitting here and I'm debugging against my SharePoint running on my local machine, I can sit there in F5 really, really quickly because it is local, right? And do iterative development where I'm, changing code and tweaking code, just going back and forth, and then only uploading when I'm actually, done or ready to test against, real data or test against the real environment. No problem. Okay. So let's go back over to the slides and talk about the client object model. So the client object model, again, was something that's new with SharePoint 2010. And in a lot of cases, we've been coming out with each version, new SharePoint web services to access different things like data or user profile and things like that. So one of the things that we wanted to do for SharePoint 2010 was to create a client object API or a client API that was really consistent across all of the different workloads, whether it's data or user profile or whatever, and do it in such a way that it would make development of things like Silverlight applications or JavaScript applications or even .NET clients, like an admin console that you're going to create. Make it really, really easy to develop those solutions with an API that's really consistent or very similar to the Microsoft.SharePoint API, and make an API that's a little bit easier to work with than something that just creates a proxy on top of a web service. So that's what the client object model is. We support .NET, Silverlight, and JavaScript. One of the nice things about these APIs is while you can't make web service calls or external web service calls from the server side in server-side code running in a sandbox solution, you can call Azure services or integrate Bing Maps or call REST APIs or OData or whatever from the client side, and then use that, use those web services to integrate or mash together that data with SharePoint data surfaced through the client object model. Okay. And again, this stuff does not, these calls don't count against the sandbox solution quota because they're to SharePoint, as far as SharePoint's concerned, those are just calls against client.svc. It's just serving up pages, just serving up those calls like it serves up pages. It's not code that's actually running in the server, so it doesn't count against sandbox solutions quotas. Okay? So if we look at an example of this, what I wanted to do is just create a Silverlight application with the client object model to provide, a front end to that list, just as an example. So what did I do? Well, I created a new sandbox solution, and I designated that I wanted to debug against that on-prem server, right? And then I created a Silverlight application and referenced the Silverlight proxy APIs. So Microsoft.SharePoint.client.silverlight, Microsoft.SharePoint.client.silverlight.runtime. Okay? Then I created my UI. Right? You can see here it's not incredibly flashy, but just kind of proves the point. We're going to give you some text boxes to enter the title, the description, the price, and then a button to click on to add the item to the list. Right? And if you look at the code behind this button, this is actually going to look really similar to you if you're used to doing server-side code, right? Where you're going to get access to the context, the SharePoint context. In this case, it's the client context object. Get access to the local web via clientcontext.web. Get access to the list collection. Get access to the actual list just by saying web.list@getByTitle, right, and getting that list that I just created. And then adding a new item through list item. You know, setting the title, the request description, the price, calling update to update the item. And then with the client object model, you can actually batch these things up. So you can load up a bunch of updates here, right, using the load method. And then you don't actually make a round trip to the server until you call execute query or execute query async. In the case of Silverlight, you want to do it asynchronously. And then it gives you a way to designate or assign the delegates that it's going to call when it calls back on that async thread. So for me, I'm just going to show a message box here using dispatcher.beginInvoke and say new item added or request failed and give the exception. Now, one of the things that you're going to note about Sandbox solutions is we don't support application pages. We support site pages, and if you want to get the same kind of work done in a Sandbox solution, you're going to probably want to either deploy a web part with that same features and functionalities in it, or deploy a site page that already has the web parts pre-deployed to that site page. And that's actually something we cover in the training kit that I'll mention at the end of the session today. In this instance, what I wanted to do is just create a Silverlight application and distribute that via a web part. When you do it that way, you actually have to pass in the URL of the site that you're running on. So what I wanted to do here is just create a little helper function to help that data be passed into Silverlight. So what I'm going to do here is change my Silverlight application to accept a parameter on the constructor to pass in that URL. And I'll actually get that URL from application started. I'm sorry, application _ startup. Okay, where I'm just going to pass it in as one of the init params on the Silverlight application. And I can wire that up from my web part just by, and actually what I wanted to do here is just create a single literal control within create child controls and have that automatically wire up the Silverlight app for me, pulling it from like a site asset library in SharePoint Online, and then pass in whatever parameters I wanted. So what I did is I created a helper function here called Silverlight Object Tag Control, which inherits from web control. So I can create it as a child object or a child control of my web part. And all this thing does is includes two parameters, one called source and one called init params. And actually, I use this to set the source of the object tag for Silverlight and actually make the object tag so it fills the entire web part, just because in this scenario, that's what I wanted to do. And then whatever initiation parameters I wanted to pass in, like in this case, the URL, so I could set the client context and start using the client object model to manipulate lists. I'm actually going to pass that into this init parameters function. So when I go back to create my actual create child controls call for my web part, this gets really, really easy. I just say create new Silverlight object tag control, and I set spcontext.current.site.url. And then I'm actually deploying this zap file, the client bin non-standard, the name of the zap file. and then setting the URL via init params. Right? So this is where it's going to find the source, and this is the URL it's going to use for the context. And deploying my zap file is really easy. I've just got a module file here that does it. Right? So I tell it, oops, let me select that again. So I just use project output references for this guy to say, hey, grab the output from the Silverlight object model app that I created and deploy that to client bin. Okay? So let's compile this guy. We'll hit F5, and then we'll actually use it in the site. We'll see it interacting with that non-standard business purchase request list. Okay? So I'm just going to edit this page. I'll say insert. I'll go to web parts. And then purchasing manager web parts. And there's the web part that I just created, the non-standard business purchase request web part. I'll click add. Okay, and then save. And let's add another conference here. So I'm going to say PDC, and I'll say platform features. And this one's a little bit more expensive, and I'll click add, and then there's my message box. And if I go to the list, you can see it just added it. Again, just using that Silverlight code and the Silverlight client object model. Okay? So if I want to deploy this guy, again, it's just a matter of packaging it and going over to SharePoint Online. And I'm just going to upload it to the solution gallery. So if you're used to doing SharePoint 2010 development, I mean, this should look really, really familiar to you, right? And you should get warm fuzzies in the fact that you're using the same APIs, the same tools, the same programming language that you're using today. It just so happens that you can deploy this to the cloud and run it up in SharePoint Online, right? So same experience here. Just adding the web part to a page. Okay? So note that this runs exactly the same way. Up in SharePoint Online. Okay, so there it's added the item to the list. Okay, so I deployed the whole solution via a sandbox solution again, but I did most of my work, even though it's a fairly simple scenario, with that client object model. And again, the client object model gives you a nice native object model that looks and feels very similar to Microsoft.SharePoint, but tailored to Silverlight.NET and JavaScript. So it's really easy to learn if you're used to Microsoft.SharePoint. And those APIs, it's really easy to learn once you go from the .NET to the Silverlight to the JavaScript library. There's minor syntax changes amongst the different versions, but they're all pretty similar and pretty easy to learn across the various versions. Okay, so let's switch back over to the PowerPoints and talk about workflows. So a common question that I get working with developers on creating SharePoint Online solutions is something along these lines. Hey, you'd mentioned that the only supported solution type for SharePoint Online is sandbox solutions, but I want to do a workflow, and I know that code-based workflows like the sequential workflow and the state machine workflow aren't supported in the sandbox. What do I do? Well, you can build declarative workflows with the SharePoint Designer 2010 tool, right, and deploy those workflows via the Save As Template feature. And one of the things that we're going to, I'll show it to you in this session, but this is actually a bigger topic that we can cover tomorrow in the other session, the workflow session. We'll actually spend an entire hour on this topic. But what you can do is you can prototype your workflow in Visio 2010. There's a SharePoint template that you can use to build out kind of the design of your workflow. And it's kind of cool that you can take that template, take that flow chart to your users, and rather than having them walk through specs, you can kind of walk them through how the workflow is going to work. You can then export that and bring it into SharePoint Designer 2010. Use its workflow designer to actually implement, the workflow declaratively. They've got a designer that you use to do this, and it's integrated with InfoPath. So InfoPath gives you the ability to create very sophisticated forms to collect and validate data for your workflow. And one of the really, really cool things about this is, though you can't do code-based workflows in SharePoint Online in the sandbox, you can create custom workflow actions in the sandbox. So let's say you get to the point where you wanted to do something in a workflow, like at a certain point in the workflow, you wanted to create a new site. Well, there's no action in SharePoint Designer 2010 for creating new sites. But that's something you can do in Sandbox Solution Code. So what you can do is you can create a custom action, deploy it as a Sandbox solution, and then it shows up in SharePoint Designer as a custom action that you can use in your workflows as part of the overall solution. And that's actually what we're going to be doing in the session tomorrow. But I'll show you an example of a workflow just so you can see kind of how workflows come together. And then tomorrow in the session, we'll actually build this workflow. Okay? And again, the cool thing about this is with SharePoint Designer, you can build the workflow on a site like we'll do tomorrow or we're doing today, where you've got a local instance of SharePoint 2010. You can develop the workflow locally against that local instance of SharePoint 2010. And then in SharePoint Designer, you can say Save As Template, which saves a WSP file of that workflow actually packaged up for you. And you can deploy that with the other WSP files that are part of your solution. Okay, so let's actually do that. Or I'll show you a running workflow, and then tomorrow we'll actually build one out. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. So we've got this list with a couple of items in it, and if you select these items, you can see that there's no workflows associated with this list. Right? This guy is grayed out. So what I did is I actually built out a workflow before I came to the session today, and then extracted it as a WSP so I could actually apply it to this list running up in SharePoint Online. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to the top level site and upload the solution just into the solution gallery. And again, this is what we'll build tomorrow. But just to give you an idea of the possibilities. So here's the workflow WSP file that I have. It's called non-standard business purchase approval .wsp. What this workflow is going to do is it's going to start a new approval process, right? Send that task to the members of the approvers group with all the information that they need in order to make a determination on whether they should approve or deny this purchase request. Those approvers can approve or reject the request, which again kicks off the next step of the workflow, where it's going to, based on whether the item was approved or rejected, send the user a mail. If it was approved, it's actually going to create a new site using a custom action for workflows built with Sandbox Solutions. It's going to create a new site. If the item was rejected, it's going to send an email, then it's going to delete the item. Okay, so that's the flow of the workflow. So I'm going to go ahead and say open. I'll activate this in the solution gallery. Okay, then let's go over to my site where the list is and turn on that feature and manage site features. And I didn't give this a pretty name, so you'll just see it down here, the non-standard business purchase approval from Web Template Labo 1. And again, this is all in SharePoint Online, and just to save time, I'm going directly to SharePoint Online here. But I'm going to turn on the feature, and then let's go over to the list and associate that workflow with this list. And again, this is something else that admittedly I could do in code, but I just thought it would be fairly straightforward if we just did it manually and then really look at the workflow tomorrow. So it's going to ask me what content type to use. Of course, I want to use the content type I just deployed as part of the solution. There you can see there's the workflow. I'll just call it non-standard business purchase approval. And then click Next. And then click Save. Let's go back over to the list. And let's apply this workflow to this list item. So I'm going to start the workflow, and this is something that's kind of cool. I'm going to collect business rationale. So I'm going to collect some information around the workflow that's not exactly stored in the list. I'm just going to store it in my workflow. I'd like to learn about SPO. And click Start. And that's going to start up the workflow. And it's going to take a second to start up for the first time just because I just uploaded the solution and just activated it. What we're going to do is we're going to go into the workflow, the in-progress workflow, and I'll show you a couple of different elements of this running workflow, and then we'll approve this thing. We'll see the site get created. And again, that site creation isn't something that's built into declarative workflows, but as we'll see tomorrow, you can create sandbox solutions to extend workflows beyond what's built in. So it's a very, very powerful tool for creating workflows. Okay. So here's my in-progress workflow, or my running workflow. You can see here one of the features that I get for free just by checking a box is that it gives me a diagram to represent the overall workflow. Like here I'm going to start the approval process. I'm going to log the results of the approval to the history list. And then based on whether it was approved or rejected, I'm going to take this custom action. Again, I didn't give this a pretty name. I just left custom action there so you could see which one was the custom code. And then that custom action will run. It'll create the new site. It'll send an email to let the person know that they should go ahead and purchase the item and so on. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and approve this. And if you look here in the task that I created, you can see that I'm pulling out information like the title, the description, the price, and then that workflow variable, their business rationale. So I'm going to go ahead and approve this. And you see here the diagram is going to update. And again, this is the first time I've run it, so it takes a second. But you can see that this step was finished. This step is running. Let's hit F5 again. Hit F5 again. OK, bam, there we go. So the custom action fired. The email was sent. If I go view all site content, and scroll down here, yeah, so there's the TechEd US 2011 SPO site that I just created, okay? So admittedly, code-based workflows aren't supported in SharePoint Online because those are full trust solutions. But declarative workflows created with SharePoint Designer 2010 and deployed into the sandbox, including any custom actions that you'd like to create with Visual Studio 2010, give you a really powerful engine for creating or automating business processes with workflows. And this is just an example of that. And I had an hour today, so I wanted to cover as much as humanly possible. So the TechEd folks actually were nice enough to give me 2 sessions. So in this session, I wanted to cover the sandbox and the client object model. We'll spend an entire hour on workflow tomorrow in OSP 306. But this was just an example of to show you what's possible as far as building declarative workflows with custom actions. Okay? So let's go back into the slides over here and wrap up. So what is SharePoint Online? Well, SharePoint Online is part of Office 365. It's a cloud-based software as a service that's based on SharePoint 2010. As far as a development platform is concerned, it's really nice that SharePoint Online, since it's based on SharePoint 2010, you can reuse the same tools and language and SDKs and APIs that you're used to today with SharePoint 2010, and they automatically apply to the cloud. The thing that you just need to keep in mind is the platform differences between SharePoint 2010 and SharePoint Online. And what are those? Well, the first is that Sandbox Solutions is the development model for SharePoint Online. It's scoped to the site collection, runs in partial trust. The client object model is another opportunity for building solutions. It's a great way to build these rich internet applications like Silverlight or JavaScript extensions to your pages. Again, it's scoped to the site collection, runs really well with SharePoint Online. Code-based workflows aren't supported in sandbox solutions, but we saw a declarative workflow, and we'll actually build them tomorrow, where you can take SharePoint Designer 2010 to build out the declarative workflow, and in any place where you actually need to run code, you just create a custom action and integrate that into your workflow and then deploy the two WSPs together. So if you want to build a SharePoint Online solution, or build even just a SharePoint Online ready solution, build for the sandbox, use the client object model, and do your workflows in the sandbox as well. And they'll automatically be compatible with compatible with SharePoint Online. Now, I put a lot of resources as far as articles and white papers and so on, as well as other courses in the ends of these slides. The one thing that I did want to mention is if you go up to MSDN and click on Learn up here at the top, and then Featured Training Courses, and scroll down, here's the Office 365 training course. And what this is it's about 22 different labs, a bunch of videos. You can download it to your local machine, do all the videos, get your beta tenancy, and actually run the code up in SharePoint Online. But it's a full development training course. It's got 7 different modules to help you understand how to develop solutions with SharePoint Online. So it's probably, out of all the resources I listed, your best resource for getting started really, really quickly building solutions for SharePoint Online. And we actually cover Link Online and Exchange Online as well, as far as creating calendaring and messaging solutions, or solutions that do presence, click-to-call, contextual calling, and so on. Okay? So that's developing collaborative solutions for SharePoint Online. Well, I want to say 2 things. One, thanks for coming to this session. I really appreciate you guys hanging out and learning about SharePoint Online. I hope you'll come to the session tomorrow. And then I know it's really hard to get out of the office and spend a week with us at TechEd. So thanks very much for coming to TechEd to learn about Microsoft technologies and kind of keeping abreast of what's going on in the development world. And I hope you guys have an awesome TechEd. Cool. Thank you. And we've got time for